Hello, my name's Brendan Kenny. I'm a lawyer out in Minneapolis. I'm a California native, and I'm recording this just because I'm a big fan of Serial, the podcast, and I think I have some thoughts on it that might be of interest to people, and also how it ties in with being a trial lawyer and storytelling and the other persuasive techniques that are so important if people want to be successful as trial lawyers. And one of the reasons I've recorded this is not only have I listened to Serial, but I've listened to some of the other podcasts that are following up on Serial, like the Slate one, the one by the writers for The Onion, and also one by this guy, I think it's called Serial Podcast Theories and Conspiracies, or something like that. Those are the only ones I could find, and I've listened to everything I could on it, as well as following some of the subreddit on Reddit. And so I wanted to talk about what I thought was important about the show from the standpoint of a trial lawyer, and look at some specific storytelling and persuasive techniques that trial lawyers would do. I can't speak as to whether Anand's lawyer did that. From some of the cross-examination I listened to, it really seemed like it was going down the wrong path, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how that might be done really well. Sorry about that sound. If you want to follow more of what I am interested in and what I think about and interests me, just feel free to find me on Twitter at Kenny, Kenny, Brendan, Brendan, just my name reversed, at, well, that's my name on Twitter. The first thing I think that's pretty important on Serial is motivation. And I agree completely with Sarah Koenig that the state's case on what motivated Anand doesn't add up. Now, it doesn't mean he didn't do it, it's just that the explanation doesn't really ring true. There really isn't an explanation or an image of this break that happened with him that led him to decide that she had to die. So I really see that as a weakness in the state's case. And I'm moving around a little bit, but I just want to kind of make some points and move on to the next thing. And I should say that I'm going to talk about motivation. I'm going to talk about the Best Buy issue, whether or not Anand really committed the murder at Best Buy, whether he called Jay there, and I'm going to talk about cross-examination, of course, and I should have said this at the very beginning. I'm not giving legal advice. I'm not really giving a legal opinion. I'm just providing some perspectives and thoughts from someone who's considers himself a trial lawyer, who's in civil litigation, has some trial experience, and thinks about it all the time in every case I work on. So, motivation. This is something that I came up with talking to my friend Mike Hatch, who we're probably going to collaborate a bit on some hangouts in the future about Serial. But as we talked, we started thinking about what kind of man is Anand? What motivates him? And there's a really interesting aside, and I can't remember which episode of Serial it is, maybe it's the second or the third or the first, and he talks about how he's the kind of guy that has to really prove something to people. And I find that very interesting because Mike Hatch and I were in the same fraternity in college, and we thought of one person who will remain unnamed who had that characteristic. He was the type of person that no matter what you were arguing about, he couldn't stop until you were convinced or you gave up. That was just the kind of guy he was. He wasn't aggressive about it, he was just unrelenting. And that is the impression I get on Anand. If you remember, he talked about the barbecue sauce, and that if you didn't have the ingredients you need, if I'm remembering right, you could use some pancake mix. People didn't believe him, and for no reason, it wasn't connected with the meal, he made some just to prove himself right. And one of the things that's interesting, and spoilers ahead if you hadn't listened to all the episodes, is that if you remember on the All About Jay episode, I think it was 8, one of his friends, Chris, said that Jay told him, I know this is hearsay upon hearsay, that Jay told him that Anand didn't call him from Best Buy, showed up at the pool hall that Jay was at, but more importantly for this point, told him that he snapped and killed A because she called him a liar, and the reason she called him, oh, I'm sorry, forgive me, not a liar, crazy. And the reason she called him crazy is because he was talking to her about her being flirtatious with some sort of car salesman, which is sort of odd because her boyfriend at the time, Don, was a shoe salesman. So maybe there was a mix-up, but it was her boyfriend. In any event, what we were thinking was, again, we're not taking a position on who's innocent and who's guilty, but let's assume for the standpoint of this that Anand did it. Well, what I could understand from his character that could, the only thing I could think of that could set him off would be if she was completely shutting him down, not listening to him, not listening to a point he said, not recognizing his point, and he could have just, gotten so frustrated. Because you might notice, if you've seen on the subreddit, and I don't mean to do this much, getting off into the weeds, but there was the breakup letter that A sent him, and in the letter she said basically, look, I don't want to fight about it, I don't want to argue about this is just the way it is, we could go back and forth forever. So this could have been part of that, and so that was just my thought, a weakness in the state's case, and how important it is to figure out the person you're talking about. Not only someone could get mad, one could imagine some person living this lie that supposedly Anand was living and just breaking down, and this woman told him no or something like that, and he broke. But the interesting thing is again, in the state's case, this was premeditated. So there was no snap. He was planning on it before. And I just have to say that the setup of, I'm going to figure a way to get into her car and strangle her, is a bit odd. Assuming she was driving, you'd have to wait till she was stopped, and what if she got the car moving? It just seems like an odd setup for premeditated murder. And connecting to what I'm going to talk about next about Best Buy and Jay, that I think a lot of commentators have lost sight of when they talk about, well, Anand did it, or reasonable doubt, or all the legal issues, is that the state had to prove, or wanted to prove, first-degree murder. And to get first-degree murder, I should say, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I know this, you have to have premeditation. You have, and it doesn't have to be a long amount of time, but there has to be some premeditation involved. It can't just be a snap and someone loses all track of time and suddenly the person ends up dead. That really can't happen for first degree murders. I understand it. At least it makes it much more difficult to prove the case if that's what's going on. So that's why it was so important in the state's case that Jay said that Anand was talking about it before, that Jay was aware of it. He said, oh, I didn't think he was serious, but certainly there was talk about it, according to Jay, that went beyond this whole, geez, I'm going to kill her, which is the sort of thing that people can't say. And you might notice in one of the episodes in the tapes, at one point Jay said that Anand said it jokingly. So it could be that the jokingly talk turned into something more serious as the state was wanting to prove first-degree murder. So just, that was my thought about motivation, that maybe if the state was able to show that the motivation was that A didn't take him seriously, wasn't listening to him, that was like impervious, closed off to the reasonable things he was saying, that could have been the reason. I could just see, based on what Anand was saying in the interviews, that he could be the type of person that could say, it's reasonable that you're not going out with me because of the problem with my parents and how difficult it is, and maybe whatever drama we have in our relationship. And this guy Don, he seems like a nice guy, and you'll notice that in the story it talks about how both Don and Anand together went out to help her with a car problem. So that's an important point. So Anand might be the type of guy that could see the reason, but when she just was, according to him, or his feelings being completely irrational, not even listening to them, that could have been what set him off. So that's just a thought about an alternate motivation that maybe would make this case more satisfying, at least to those of us listening to think, well, maybe that would explain what happened, but the problem for the state in that case is that there'd be a good argument that it wasn't first-degree murder, and if it wasn't first-degree murder, you'd have a shorter period of time and parole eligibility, and it would be a different kind of case. Best Buy. I've had the same feeling about Best Buy parking lot really from the beginning that Sarah had, and you might remember, I think it was in the 9th episode, where she said, I just don't buy the state's theory about Best Buy. I don't buy their timeline. And I feel that way just from what I'm hearing with the phone booth, and the timing would have been difficult, and also I really felt like it struck me how strongly Anand was putting his hope on Best Buy. He was putting his hope that the Best Buy theory wouldn't make any sense, that you couldn't commit the murder in the time that was there to get to and from, or from school to Best Buy. So I think that regardless of views on the case, that suggested to me that Anand was never at Best Buy on that day, one way or the other. And it is striking that that's part of Jay's timeline, or the state's timeline through Jay, and according to, if we can trust Chris and Chris's description of what Jay told him, that wasn't part of the original story. And I will talk more about this in the cross-examination, but if I was defense counsel in this case, I would have the same focus that former police officer that Sarah Koenig's people hired to look at the case. I want to know what happened on those 3 hours before Jay's confession was recorded. I want to know that. And as defense counsel, it might actually be helpful that I don't know that, because that time is a black box, and I can take the surrounding circumstances and I can put pretty much anything I want in that black box. And what I mean by that is we have Jay's story change, we have inconsistencies, we have things somewhere in the story that, according to the state's timeline, wouldn't have been possible. And I think, from listening to the jury, they listened to it and they thought, well, we trust Jay, we believe him, and no one's perfect, and sure, there's some things in the story that don't make sense, but that's part of life. The important thing is that we believe his story, that Anand did it, and that it was murder, and that seemed to be pretty much all they needed to believe. And they also found it important that Jay, by saying these things, was potentially implicating themselves. And you'll remember that the juror they talked to, she was really thrown off when Sarah told her that Jay didn't spend a day in jail or prison. But they were assuming that, well, this guy's implicating himself. So those 3 hours are really important, because we figure out, we would, if we could get that, how the story developed, what Jay said going in and what happened. And where that ties in with Best Buy is that the Best Buy event, or non-event, depending on the way you look at it, is key to the story, to the whole timeline that the state had. And the phone call at, I think it was 2:36, whether or not that happened is so key to the state's timeline. And if you can destroy that timeline, if you can take that piece out, arguably the whole thing falls. I've got to take a break right now. We'll start up part 2 of this, and I will finish up with Best Buy and talk about Jay.